Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this episode of the Women of the Word podcast. We're glad you're here because we've got a great episode for you. Like we mentioned in our previous episode, today we get to welcome our first guest to the show. So, Jen, can you introduce our guest for us and tell us what she'll be joining us to talk about?
I would love to. Today we are going to hear from my friend and colleague, Elizabeth Woodson. Elizabeth and I have known each other. Elizabeth, we were talking about this. How long have we known each other?
Probably over 10 years.
Over 10 years. Yep, over 10 years. And we served together on staff in the local church where we wrote and taught curriculum together. That's why I wanted everyone to hear from Elizabeth today, because we share a lot of overlap in the way that we think about writing curriculum. And I wish I could say we shared overlap in teaching, but I feel like Elizabeth exercises a whole set of skills that I am not good at. With excellence. And so, Elizabeth, when I first met you, it was around the issue of curriculum writing.
It was.
Yes.
It was.
Tell us a little about what you're doing now, and then tell a little about how you and I got together.
Yeah. Right now, I get to serve the local church in a couple of different ways. And so I write curriculum. So I write studies with Lifeway resources and super excited about that. I have a podcast, which I talk about theology and discipleship. And then I also do leadership training. And so I travel to different churches and train them, specifically women, in how to be better leaders within the church, which is something I also really love.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got connected because I was a seminary student. I graduated from Dallas Theological Seminary, and I wanted to learn how to write curriculum. And I heard you on a podcast, and I looked you up because that's what all good people do. You're like, I like this person. Who are they? And I found you were local, and you wrote Bible studies on like Exodus. I'm like, who does this? And so I need to meet this woman. And what's funny is my friends and I talked about it for a while. And they're like, Elizabeth, you just need to email her. Just be courageous. Just email her. And so I did. And the Lord really blessed that conversation that we had. And it just blossomed into a friendship and mentorship.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just really grateful for how you've poured into my life and really showed me what it is to help people understand the Bible through writing curriculum.
Well, and I think it's a friendship. It's been mutually edifying. We've joked about how I always say I'll give one coffee to everybody, and then we see how it goes from there. And Elizabeth showed up at a Starbucks with it's our special Starbucks where we drive by it and we think warm thoughts about each other. But she showed up at a Starbucks and she said, "I have written a curriculum on Jonah, or I'm trying to write a curriculum on Jonah, and I wondered if you would take a look at it." And I said, "Well, how are you using this curriculum?" And she said, "Oh, I have 3 women who come into my apartment to study each week." And I was like, this is my person. This is not someone who's like looking to be a big deal. She just wants to do good work for the people in front of her. And so, and then we just had a lot of overlap in the way that we think about things. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about some of that. You've had a lot of experience in the area of women's Bible study at this point. Specifically, you've had experience with curriculum creation because I kept forcing you to help. Once I lured you onto staff with me, I was like, I need some help. So tell me, what do you love about curriculum? We've talked in a previous episode about the 3-legged stool of learning. So we have the personal study time, and then small group discussion time, and then finally the teaching time. So we get to talk about that first leg and how it's going to relate to those other 2. But tell me, what do you love about curriculum writing? And you can also feel free to share what you find challenging about it.
What I love is that, in fact, it is a challenge.
Yeah.
Because the goal is, whatever book of the Bible you're walking people through, how do I help them dig deep in a way that is not so overwhelming they shut the book, but is not so easy that they breeze through and think, oh, I know all these things.
Mm-hmm.
Like we talk about this tension, this dissonance we want to leave people with, because that's part of the learning process. And to me, it really is the blank page all the way to a finished workbook is a challenge of creating something that is a really great tool to help someone learn, but not just learn information, right? We're not just here for just information gathering. We're here for transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do I help them study deep, but in such a way that their lives are changed to know and love God more? And so it's an adventure every time.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I love about it.
Mm-hmm. And at the beginning, I always feel like at the beginning of writing a curriculum, I feel like there's this mountain in front of me that I'm not going to be able to climb.
Yep.
And then you get to the end of it, you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I got here, but now I have to teach it. So it feels, I always say curriculum writing is the hardest thing I do. Have you found that to be true as well?
Yes. If you write curriculum, if you do a good job with it, teaching is much more easier.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing I found about the model that we have used that's just been really great is you do a lot of the work that you would do for teaching in the writing. And so you come back to the teaching and it's like, oh, I'm already legs ahead because of this process.
And you're touching on a major tenet of what we try to do. We understand the learning outcome to be achieved through each of the three legs of the stool, which means that the curriculum writing itself, whether you're writing it yourself, we'll talk about this in a minute, or whether you're using someone else's, you need to understand that the curriculum is the first step in the learning outcome. It's the start of the teaching, and it's the form of the teaching that will ultimately happen when it's time to sit down and have that part take place. But when you think about curriculum writing, how do you think about it contributing to active learning?
Yeah, curriculum writing, really what you're trying to do is what people, that's how I'll say it. In our moment, people have been trained to be consumers.
Yeah.
And so they're trained to come in and they're trained to just receive whatever they're taught. And then that's what they walk away with.
Yeah.
And so curriculum writing invites people to meet a journey of discovery that says, you are the learner. You are the person that has an opportunity to dig deep. Before I give you what the Lord has opened up to me in the text, I'm inviting you to do that work. And so even the placement of the teaching after the curriculum is intentional because we want people to be engaged actively and not just passive receivers. And that happens when we invite them to dig in the text on their own through good curriculum.
Elizabeth, when you're choosing a Bible study curriculum that you didn't create, what do you look for to evaluate its usefulness? What would you say are the marks of a good curriculum? And then on the flip side, what would you say are marks of an unhelpful one?
Well, the only curriculum I ever use is my own. So I don't know. No, that's not true. That's not true.
If only.
If only.
Uh-huh.
And so the marks of a good curriculum to me, really, there are these two elements. I will label them kind of the writing or teaching that happens in the book and the questions that are provided. And so there are some studies where there's a lot of writing, a lot of teaching that happens, and there's only a few questions. And so those are going to be ones that I shy away from because I want people to not spend as much time receiving as they do thinking. And so that's going to be one kind of category I look at. And then they said, what are the type of questions they're asking? Are they asking questions that are more reflection, that are more of how do you feel about this versus what is it saying? What do you observe in the text? What do you think the author is trying to communicate? Why would this be significant to the audience? And again, I do want reflection. I do want people to take an opportunity to think about what they're reading. But if that's the majority of what the questions are asking, again, I'm probably going to shy away from that because I want something that's going to stretch my audience just a little bit. And so it really is going to be in the what types of questions they're asking and how many questions they're asking in proportion to the other writing that we see in that workbook.
That's
And I
good.
also tend to do ones that go through books of the Bible.
Yeah. I mean, and from a literacy standpoint, we really, we need to do that because there are so many, we've talked about this a lot. There are so many books of the Bible, like Exodus, as you were trolling me for earlier, that are longer than you're typically going to get exposure to in a sermon series, or a lot of times even in a Bible study setting. There's this thinking, well, women won't come along with us on a trip that's that long. But when we switch to active learning, we actually find that they do. They want the bar to be raised. You said that you would shy away from a curriculum that has a lot of commentary written into the curriculum. How does we wouldn't say that those are bad curricula, but we're talking about doing something a little different here. How does a curriculum like that potentially sabotage the three-legged stool that we've talked about?
Yeah, when we give you, because a lot of times the commentary, again, that person is teaching, that person is giving you sometimes the answers to the questions after they've written them. And there's all a process of that, right? So again, it's not a bad study, but what we want to do is we want to place a person in this position of, I have to figure out what the answer to this question is, and there's not going to be an extreme amount of help available to me just reading through the commentary. Or I need to figure out what my own opinion about the text is before somebody else gives me their opinion. And so a lot of really great studies are just really wonderful commentaries, beautiful commentaries.
Yeah, with
and
a
we
few
tell people,
questions sprinkled in.
a few questions sprinkled in. And so it's like, we tell people in the process, don't open the commentary until after you've gone through the questions. And so really it is that process of, and again, we are not trained to do that. And so it makes people really uncomfortable.
They hate it.
They're a little frustrated. They're like, just give me the answer or tell me the right answer.
Yes.
And if we're good about writing the questions, we're gonna be like, well, we're going to need you to sit in that for a little bit.
Yeah.
And then the teaching, we try to come along and resolve a little bit of that dissonance, but we want you to experience it just a little bit. And so the commentaries, they're not bad. they just get ahead of the
Right.
process. And we want people to spend a little bit more time sitting in that learning space.
Now that you have some studies of your own that are out there published, do you get people who DM you and say, "Can I get the answer key to this study?" That happens to me a lot.
Well, here's the funny thing. In my first study, there's one question that was just not good. And
Yeah, well, that is
everybody
mhm.
asked me, "What did you mean by this?"
You're
And
like,
I was like,
"Shoot."
not a great question. Yeah.
Which actually brings us to a really important factor of
Mhm.
writing your own curriculum. When you write your own curriculum, how important is it for someone to work through it before you hand it to a larger group of people to use?
It is probably one of the most important things you can do
Mhm.
because one, you think you wrote a really good question and it actually is a confusing
Yeah, I
question.
always think I did an amazing
It's
job,
like,
and
it's
then you're like,
great.
"Hmm."
Maybe not, maybe not. And it just is like you having someone else's perspective or piloting it with a group lets you know the hurdles that, okay, I'm asking you to cross something that is too big. You need a
Yeah.
little bit more help with
Yeah.
this, or it just was not clear. I just released a study on Galatians, and how I approached that study changed dramatically after teaching it and writing
Mhm.
curriculum for a group of people. And so that to me is a super important part of the process.
Mhm. That lengthens the timeline between when you
Hmm.
write it and when you can use it, but I would agree with you. You really cannot skip that. The way that I learned to write better questions was by sitting in a living room, hearing people respond in
Yes.
real time to the questions that I had written and being like,
Yes.
"Oh, that's what you got from that? Well, that was not what I was going for." Yeah.
Maybe piggybacking off of that idea a little bit, how do you balance the need for depth in a Bible study curriculum with
Mhm.
the desire for accessibility and practicality for participants?
Yeah, for me, I think every study has an audience in mind. And so what I tell women is you got to know your people, and everybody's group is at a different level. And so some people are used to studies with a lot of theological depth. And so that's not going to be a problem for them. Other people, that might be a little bit too much. And so how do I create questions that match where my people are at? And to
Mhm.
me, it is really, it's a numbers game. So I'm going to ask a specific number of questions or write a specific number of questions for a particular week. And so I might ask maybe one or two more reflection questions if I know that I've taken people a little bit too deep, but I don't want them to drown in the waters of theology, so to speak. But a different group, I might ask them less because I
Yeah.
know they're more accustomed to that. And so it really is, you have to tailor it to your people.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes people forget that. Don't just try to pull something that worked for somebody else. Tailor it to your group and what they're going through and the level of education and
Mhm.
level of exposure to the depth of doctrine and those type of things.
Mhm.
Yeah, and a lot of times we don't have to sacrifice the depth of what we're saying. We have to choose the words with which we're
Hmm.
communicating it in a way
Hmm.
that's accessible to them too.
Hmm.
Whenever you said that you write a specific, you're going to write a specific number of questions. When you think about that, are you thinking I would like people to spend an hour with this week, or are you thinking like I'm just going to write 8 questions, and if that takes people 4 hours, some weeks 1 hour? How do you think about time whenever you're thinking about writing?
Yeah, I do think about the amount of time that people are going to commit to it. And I
Mhm.
just try to be realistic again with
Yeah,
the groups that I'm working with. And so over the years, I've learned that a certain amount of questions usually results in a certain amount of time.
sure.
And so I try to stick to that. Sometimes I write, it's just a whole set of questions. I've done that with Jen. We split it up into 4 different sections.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's days
Mhm.
in some of the studies that I've done, but it really is. How much expendable time do I think people are actually going to commit to this? And maybe I'm gonna press them a little bit more, and that will be my questions for the week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've typically landed between an hour, hour and a half of
Mhm.
work for someone who might not be familiar with the
Yeah.
method. Because you have to take into account this will be the first study that some of the people will have
Mhm.
done that follows
Mhm.
along that way. And I've wrestled with, I don't know how you feel about it, Elizabeth, but I've wrestled with do I give them 5 days or not?
Yeah.
And I think I've made my peace with it. I think that it's because in my own style of learning is not to do like a once a day kind of a
Mhm.
thing, but it is a big help to a lot of women. And so I've finally just been like, you know what? If this is a help, why am I railing against it? Like you need to give that. It's a way of helping in the same way that thinking about the words that you choose is a way of helping. So, and I think that's one of the key things that Elizabeth and I have worked hard on is you're going to raise the bar in what you're asking women to do with this kind of a curriculum, which means you really need to be thoughtful about removing any barriers to them participating that might prohibit them saying, oh, I can do this. I can do something that's harder than I've done before. Okay, so if someone is considering whether to write her own curriculum or to use an existing one, what advice would you give to her?
I would say first, if you've never done it before, that using someone else's curriculum that's really good is not a bad thing. It doesn't mean you're taking the easy route out. It's a training process. And so we were together recently, Jed, and we laughed about this, that you're like, how are you like writing these questions? And I was like, I'm just looking at previous studies that you've done. And so it is like
It was a little more narcissistic than that. I was like, you are writing such good questions. How are you doing this? And she's like, I pulled up your old study and just followed the formula. And I was like, okay. But here's the deal. I'm not doing something new. You know, I don't want to do new things. I want to do things that are tried and true. And so, I mean, I can't take credit for even the question formulas that I'm using. But anyway, so you're helping someone evaluate whether they're ready to write their own. Go ahead.
Ready to write their own. And so what you need to, the question you answer is, do I have the time? And it just is time intensive. And so I would encourage you to take some time to think about what you have available in your schedule to commit to something like that. And maybe it is this semester, we do a study that somebody else has already done. And while we're going through the study, I'm writing my own. So I'm ready for the next semester. And so if you figure out that like, hey, I don't have the time for this, or I don't feel comfortable, it feels really intimidating to write questions. I don't know where to start. Again, let me practice by looking at other studies that are really good. And that's what I would suggest. If someone does decide I have the time, I feel courageous enough to do it, that you would get studies that ask really good questions and learn from those questions, because that's what we all do, right?
Even when we're writing our own, right? Like even today, if I'm sitting down to write a new curriculum, I'm still going to look at how other people have tackled it.
Yeah. And so it is, if you have the time, if you feel courageous enough to step in, which hopefully you do at some point, then go find good resources to help guide you. Do not just sit down to the blank page and feel like you're just going to come up with really great questions off the dome. Don't do that to yourself. Get some samples and learn from the way people ask questions.
How long does it take you from beginning to completion to create a curriculum? That might be helpful to people.
Yeah, for me, it's going to take me a couple months. And so I would say 3 to 4 months is going to take me from beginning to end. I usually write 8-week curriculums. Jen writes longer curriculums. And so Jen can tell you how much time it takes her to do that. But that's usually the time that I set aside. And so just being ahead of the game is just really helpful, because after you write the curriculum, you then have to write your teaching. And so you want to help yourself out with that.
That's good.
When you write your curriculums, do you write questions as you're going through? So, okay, I did chapter 1, now I'm going to write all the questions. Or do you study all at once and then go back and do all the questions afterwards?
I will get an overview of the book. And so I probably have a research phase and then a writing phase. And so the research, I am getting an overview. I have identified a few good commentaries that I'm going to resource. I don't use all the commentaries. I just limit myself to 2 or 3, because there's so many you could choose from. And really, the commentaries are there to help and guide you. We're not here just to regurgitate what they're saying, that we as a teacher are doing what we're asking our students to do. And so after I do the research, then I do go chapter by chapter. And so I'll do the first chapter, and then I work through the questions I've written, so that I'm like, is it easy enough for somebody to answer this question without being completely confused? That's the first layer. And then getting somebody else to do it will be the second layer.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, and I try to choose commentaries that are of different levels, so that I'm hearing different voices talk about the same content at different levels. But I'm with you. I think people think, oh, I have to read every single thing. And it's no, you got to choose the voices that are that are enlivening your own thinking the most, and then go with that, because that's what's going to come through in the curriculum and in the teaching is, this really brought me alive, and I wanted to bring you alive too. And I think people can feel like they didn't do enough homework if they do that. But if you've got someone who's dependable, that's a really good setup for you. So, okay, so you talked about whether to write your own or whether to use someone else's. And it might be that you modify someone else's, right? Sometimes you're going to modify what someone else has done. And it does matter, I think, how experienced, you are, once you've done some teaching too, you get
Yeah.
a sense of like, oh, does this lead me toward the learning? Again, think about learning outcomes. What we're
Exactly.
often thinking about is how women experience
Mhm.
something. I'm still having trouble eradicating that language from,
Yeah.
sometimes I'll get something back from an editor and it'll say Bible study experience, and I cross out the word experience. I'm like, it's not that you won't have an experience of it. It's
Yeah.
just that in all female circles, sometimes we think the main thing is how we felt about it.
Mm.
And I want you to feel something, but I want you to think. And so a good curriculum can help guide them toward that. I'm gonna take this next question because I feel responsible for your answer. What has been this is like you basically giving me a job review on a podcast in real time, but I would imagine that I have some of the same thoughts that you do. What has been your experience team writing curriculum? Because like you might be like, gosh, this is a lot of work. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get 3 or 4 people to help me with this. So, what's your experience team writing curriculum? Is it like a win net? Like or is it like, whoa, that was complex? I'd love to hear your perception of how that went.
Of how that went, little job review. I will say it depends on the people on the team. And so the people that we worked with were good about giving their best to the project, and you didn't have to hunt them down to turn their stuff in. So I think we all know what group projects are like. So there's feelings we might have about them. And so it really is having people who are at least committed to writing good content. I think the challenge comes is because you have different people, you have different voices. And so you also have different styles. And so you, as the editor, so to speak, and I know Jenna has done this and I've done this in some of the studies when we work together, is bringing those voices together so it's not so jarring for the reader that they feel like they're going into a completely different book with each chapter. And so that can be the challenging aspect if you have differing views on how to handle a particular theological idea or how we want to approach writing this week, or even the activities. If someone just it's like, hey, I want you to draw for the entire week, and there's no questions. We're like, well, we're here to ask people questions. And so it's those things that you got to bring people on the same page. And that means you need a really good editor and someone who's very kind, but also firm.
And did you have that, Elizabeth, in your experience?
I had an editor. I don't feel no. My editor was great. And hey, I'm the person that appreciates direct feedback, and my editor was like, let's try this again.
Well, this is why you and I work together so well. I think, frankly, it's because both of us want true feedback on stuff, and we give. I mean, you've given me feedback, and yeah, Elizabeth has an actual degree in some of this, and I do not. I just learned the hard way by trial and error. So I've learned a great deal from you on that as well. Yeah, I think back on that time, we started team writing curriculum largely for developmental reasons for other people who were in the teaching pipeline, and it was a whole process of onboarding people not just into writing questions, but into a way of doing education. And what I always like to remind people who are listening to this is it's not mysterious. It's the way that any institute of higher learning would think about training people into managing a classroom space for a learning outcome. And so for those of you who are listening who maybe have taught in the school system or who have had any form of teaching that was learning outcome based, you probably have a lot of the skills that you need. You just need to have the confidence to bring them into the church, because in many cases the church has forgotten that it's many things, but it is an institute of learning. And when we lose sight of that, you get a lot of stuff that's appealing just to the emotional level or the application level without asking people to actually be drawn in to learn. So I have mixed feelings about team writing curriculum. It's good for the person who's learning the skill. It's hard for the editor.
Yes.
It is. It's not what I want people to understand is there is not less work with team writing. There's actually more work. It is good work. I'm grateful that we had a whole team full of people on the other end of it who really knew their stuff. But it is not the short path to writing a curriculum by any stretch.
So in our discussion of the three-legged stool, we're talking about curriculum, which is the first leg. Second leg is going to be this small group time. So if we kind of think about how leg 1 and leg 2 kind of connect curriculum to small group discussion, what role does the group discussion play as you either choose the curriculum or you write one yourself? And how should that curriculum help facilitate dialogue while also maintaining the focus of the learning outcome? That was a lot of questions. Let me know if you want to answer that.
We'll chart it out for you.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. Let me know if I don't answer your question.
Okay.
Probably the simple answer is I try to write questions. I try to include questions in that week's curriculum that will make for good discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are generally not questions that are answered with a yes or no. I mean, you have a range of people in the group. You always have someone who has a plethora of things to say. But for the most part, you want people to be able to engage in a dialogue. And so sometimes those are the reflection questions, asking appropriate level. And so I might not press in too much because people might not feel comfortable sharing all of their business in the group. Maybe talking about a hypothetical person versus themselves. But it is, if I was in the group, how would I talk about this question? And that to me leads me into writing something that's going to provide, whether it's observation, interpretation, or even application that can be unpacked in a group environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, it's just being conscious of those things, because you can write good questions that have like very short answers to them.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll have a very short group time.
And a lot of awkward silence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and do you think the statement you made about application questions and not wanting to ask people to be too vulnerable, you might phrase it in a way where it's more generalized. I find that I can take a question that they're answering in their personal study time that maybe was very pointed,
Mm-hmm.
and then have a separate list of like, here are the questions you should go through this week, and give it in a more generalized way for them to talk about in the group. Because when I do that, I feel like it's a little bit of a workaround. They have to do some hard work, and then they can choose their level of vulnerability when they're actually discussing it with the group. And then I think another thing I've learned to think about is the further into the study you are, you can assume that people have built more trust and are able to answer a more vulnerable question in a group. And that's a real skill for people to develop. At the church that I have served at, actually the churches I've been at pretty much my whole adult life, vulnerability was a real value, and people came ready to answer questions like that. I think it's why I tend to write questions that make people squirm a little, but not every church is like that. And so when you're thinking, is this something you might be thinking like from a formation standpoint of like, how can we train people into a way of being when they're in a group with people that might not feel intuitive to them?
Yeah. And I would add to that, there are things that will pop up in the book that can be theological landmines.
Yes.
And so if you know that ahead of time, give your group leader help by giving them a direction or way to answer that question. Because those also tend to come up in the small group meeting. You've gone through this chapter. And if you don't cover the elephant in the room, somebody else is going to bring it up, and it could go whatever direction. And so it's like, how do you also care for your group leaders and providing them support for the things that might be more difficult in the conversation?
That's a really good point. And it raises another question about when you're using someone else's curriculum, because all of us serving in the local church want to be in glad submission to those who are setting the doctrine of the church that we're in. And so you want to make sure that if there is something that is distinctive of your own church's theology, that you're honoring to that in the way that you're discussing it in a curriculum or in a discussion group time. Sometimes your group leaders may not have top of mind awareness about what those issues are. And it doesn't mean that you just go, oh, this is what our elders think. It means that you say, this is where our church lands. There's discussion on this, but this is where we land, just to kind of make sure that everybody is able to have a reference point as they're forming their own thinking around something. So yeah, that's really good. Hey, no lie, this is a fun conversation for me to have with you. Thank you for taking the time to be on this episode with us. Tell us what you're working on right now.
Yeah, what I'm working on right now is I just released a study on the book of Galatians. It is in the vein of what we've just talked about this entire conversation.
Who saw that coming?
No one. I mean, that's such a surprise. And so it is through Lifeway, and really, I'm excited because I love Paul, because he takes the false gospels of the culture and breaks them down to point to the truth of the gospel in a way that I think is relevant for our time and day. And then I'm also working on a book that will come out in 2026 called Habits of Resistance, 7 false stories you were stuck in and gospel practices to help break you free.
That sounds amazing. And tell us all the name of your podcast.
So I host a podcast called Starting Place, and it is a discipleship podcast. And so if you have walked with the Lord for some time, it is inviting you an opportunity to go deeper in your faith. We talk about discipleship, theology, Bible exposition, the whole gamut to help you go deeper to know and love God more.
That's awesome. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us today. We so appreciate everything you shared. And thanks to our listeners who tuned in, and be sure to join us next week as we continue our discussion of the three-legged stool. We'll see you then.